Yeah, okay. Maybe I'll lead in by just recapping briefly what we talked about last time. We covered lots of different topics, I guess, broadly around uh, AGI, political coalitions that are forming in response to rapid progress, what those coalitions might look like, what they might do. Uh, well, I guess we didn't talk much about what they might do. We were just kind of describing what we see happening. And the suggestion at the end of last session was to talk about what these groups are aiming at, what their vision of a good outcome is, and that, of course, informs what they will do. So that's one thing we should pick up. There was also, I suggested last time we just update our view on timelines a little bit. Partly that's just instructive because I can look back at our seminar from the end of 2022 and it already feels like a long time ago. So when things are moving very rapidly, it's good to just reflect on what you thought was going to happen and what did actually happen as a way of just calibrating. Otherwise, we just tend to get carried along in the short-term changes and not see the forest for the trees. There also, I sent Adam some tweets from Mark Andreessen, which I think are interesting. So Mark Andreessen's been very active lately, expressing his views as an accelerationist. So maybe that's something we could talk about. And yeah, I guess plenty of other things. Any other big ticket items you want to shove onto the agenda, Adam?
No other big ones. The Yeah, the one thing that I think that we were talking about good outcomes or outcomes in general. I think we could talk about both good and bad outcomes because the various stakeholders, I think, perceive both of those things differently. There are different conceptions of what good outcomes might be with AI, and there are also different conceptions of what bad outcomes are. So there's a whole sort of ecosystem or smorgasbord, I guess, of these different envisioned outcomes and the valence of those things from the perspective of different interests. And then I agree, updating the timeline makes some sense because I think the primary lens we want to bring to those outcomes is, how plausible are they? The good and bad. What's plausible? What stuff is knowable? What stuff is just unknowable? And would it be useful in advance to be able to, for example, dismiss whole categories of outcomes as just extremely implausible or impossible or something like that. And I think that would be useful, especially if we then loop back and tie that together with the sort of the 4-quadrant matrix that we were looking at last time of with AGI and politics, and looking at these different the positioning of different interests with respect to these possible outcomes. So I see all of that fitting together quite nicely. We'll see how much we can cover. And then the one other thing, Dan, I don't know if you mentioned it. I apologize if you did already before I got here. But that was this analogy. I think this potentially very important and useful analogy to the Manhattan Project, and discussing where are the parallels, what parallels hold and what ones don't, which things are the same, which things are different this time. I think it's useful to talk about that specific historical parallel in some detail.
Yeah, good. Maybe I'll ground this discussion a little bit. I mean, it's fun to talk about these things, even if they're not so relevant to us in our individual lives. But for example, with the Manhattan Project, okay, this discussion here, at some point, one of us or all of us over the next 10 years might end up being tapped on the shoulder for something like that, or be thinking about joining one of these coalitions for or against. And so it's far from purely academic, I think. Okay, where should we start? So maybe let's go through these groups on the board and talk a little bit about what they think good outcomes are. Well, which one are you again, Adam? Techno-environmentalist, maybe?
Yes, and as I think I mentioned last time, I believe I did, sort of reluctantly.
Sure.
Normally, I would be fairly strong techno-environmentalist with respect to other new technologies, but in the case of AI, uh, I I think I would probably be less. Yeah, I think I explained this last time. I would be less of less bullish, less of a booster than normal, specifically for AI, given its risks. But I remain, I think, an accelerationist because I don't see a better option given what I perceive to be an unavoidable arms race in this space. And if there's truly an arms race that's totally unavoidable, then we have to act such that the the most responsible, the best uh, horse in that race has the greatest chance of winning. So I'm afraid I'm still, with some reluctance, in the accelerationist techno-environmentalist camp.
Triku says, I see your point, friend, but accelerationism can lead to unforeseen risks.
Yes, it can.
Okay. All right, so what's a good outcome for you?
Well, in my mind, I think several things. The first is that we have a reasonably stable economic transition, and by that I think a lot of other things flow out of that in the near term. AGI, the general intelligence, especially of the agentic and sapient kind, is a wild card in this. But setting that aside for one moment, in my mind, a good outcome here is one in which the global economy is not plunged into a sort of internecine period of turmoil and chaos by this new technology, from which we eventually emerge to a higher level of prosperity. An ideal outcome, in my mind, economically, would be that we manage to integrate these new tools in a relatively smooth, relatively seamless fashion, such that they only continue to foster economic prosperity writ broadly, writ large across the global economy. If that's possible, then I think social stability could follow. I think economic prosperity is an extraordinary enabling condition and an extraordinarily powerful stabilizing force socially. I think this is sort of something we can infer by situations where there's a lack of economic prosperity, where economic prosperity does not exist, or where economic prosperity abruptly fails. What we see is social unrest, violence, conflict, war. And so I think economic stability in transition is a very, very high priority in my mind. So for all of the wonderful potential benefits that AI, leading, short and narrow AI, not AGI or of the, especially of the sapient kind, for all of its tremendous benefits, a major risk in my mind of a bad outcome is one of a profound economic destabilization, even if that's only temporary, because I think there could be very, very severe social and geopolitical consequences of that. So if we can avoid that, that would be a great outcome. And that's sort of a nearer term outcome, I think. And then I think the only thing I will say about a good outcome with respect to artificial general intelligence, both of the sort of non-agentic oracle kind and of the agentic sapient kind, I would say if we can somehow avoid massive misalignment and not get all of us turned into paper clips, that would be great.
Okay, let me push back on that a bit. So let me put on a neo-communist or anarchist or more. You're someone who has his qualms about the current system, but more or less sees it as worth preserving, at least as a stopgap or something that is better than just rolling the dice and ending up somewhere completely random. I think many parties, and perhaps neo-communists or anarchists would be among them, would say that this is the chance, right? This is the moment when we get to decide on the configuration. Once we're on the other side, maybe it's quite stable and resists change, partly because whoever controls the AIs will be very hard to dislodge. Or maybe to put it differently, the hesitate to say biases, but the biases built into the AIs will determine perhaps the way things go. So you see it as a value, as a good outcome to have economic stability. For some people, that's just another word for perpetuating the deeply unequal and unfair status quo, perhaps ad infinitum. So I think that we could perhaps divide the accelerationists into those who see the challenge of the transition as preserving something approximating what we have, and then maybe making good with the fruits of the technology on the other side of that transition, from the camps who see the within the accelerationists who see the transition as an opportunity. Does that make sense, do you think?
I think that's perfectly fair. Let, I guess I will say two things. I think these are two connected ideas. Maybe we can talk about where they interface. The first is this idea of equitable distribution of prosperity, and the concern that we really don't want things to get worse than they are, because they aren't great right now. As much prosperity as we have, as much material prosperity as even the richest societies have, there's still a deeply, deeply suboptimal amount of uneven distribution of the wealth and prosperity within any society. And so I think that's a perfectly fair criticism. Certainly would sustain the criticism that really under no circumstances do we want distributional inequities to get worse. And there is a risk of that with any new technology, any disruption, but it seems especially the AI disruption of labor. Okay, so I actually completely accept that. The second idea I want to introduce here, and we think about how they interface, is that what I think I care about most analytically is, are we producing the material constituents of prosperity, and what are those? What are the distributional challenges? So for all of the sort of populism we see today, and there is a general public awareness that things are not fair. I think the general public is not very tuned into, and thus does not really care who owns what, as long as shit still gets produced and they can go and buy it, and they have money in their pockets to buy it with. I think whether it's Elon Musk or a government that's producing the cars that people want to buy and drive, it doesn't matter. And maybe the people aren't going to be too fussed. The public is not going to be either more or less dissatisfied with changes in ownership. So that I'm not so concerned about. What I think makes a bigger difference for stability is whether there are still products, whether there are still goods and services available at the grocery store to go and buy them, and whether you still have money in your pockets to go buy them with. And I'm very concerned in the near term about destabilization that then results in effectively supply shortages and empty supermarket shelves. We saw some of that in the pandemic. Learned that lesson in some painful ways. That is a real problem. That is a recipe for social unrest, violence, and so forth.
Why do you foresee that?
As long as that doesn't happen, and I think there is potential for AI to be onboarded and for us to still produce things, then the bigger question is, where do people get the money in their pockets from so that they can make a claim on all of the stuff that is on the productive capacity, which is growing, which is expanding, presumably as a result of the new technology. So that's the lens that I look at it through. There is the equitability, or there's the distributional aspect of things, and then there's the overarching question of is what people want still getting produced. So we have to. Those are two deeply, I think, connected questions.
Can you explain why you think there might be supply chain disruptions? Yeah.
Well, so for example, you could take any product that you can imagine the production is automated increasingly with new technology. Okay, you automate the production, and at least in principle, its costs might even fall. Okay, so you're becoming more productive by taking on these new tools and onboarding them, and maybe you're passing some of those savings on to consumers. Maybe you're not. But what's happening as a result of any of those disruptions is that you are casting former employees of the previous industry. They are losing their livelihoods, and if too much of that happens, then you end up with I think very quickly a very abrupt swings in demand.
Right.
And it doesn't take a it does not take, I think this is what the pandemic showed us. It does not take very many swings, and this can be up and down. Swing upwards in demand. Famously, notoriously during the pandemic, there was a crazed rush in the United States for toilet paper, for goodness sake. There were toilet paper shortages for weeks. It was absurd, right? That was because of a panicked upswing in demand. But we could also have a panicked downswing in demand. And industries today, at least partly because they're very streamlined, they're very efficient, and they have not too much slack. They often can't survive very long with an abrupt downturn in demand, and that then ricochets reverberates through their supply chain. And so what I'm very concerned about upswings and downswings both of demand from consumers that then turn into supply and demand shocks that then cause parts of the supply chain to fail. And I think, again, we've sort of seen that at different times as a result of the pandemic. Demand for things booms, then demand for things plummets, and it's that destabilization, that volatility that put this global supply chains into sort of a little bit of chaos. So that is something that I'm deeply concerned about as a consequence of the disruption of labor.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. Okay, maybe let's take another group, maybe in the Kubernetes camp, and talk about what a good outcome would look like. I'll just put up supply chain disruption here. Let's see. I find it a bit harder to put my head into these categories. Let's see. I mean, there's, as Matt was saying last time, right? You can be kind of in favor of technological progress, but think that it's pointless unless we survive and thrive in that world with that progress. I think that's fine. A little bit boring from a narrative point of view, perhaps, but more seriously, I think we should keep in mind that when we're talking about large social movements and reactions to disruptions in society, the nuanced positions often don't have much of a chance. I mean, what dominates the dynamics is often the rather extreme ends of one of these positions. So I think the camp of people like Matt, unfortunately, will remain fairly small. Maybe I would put myself in that category as well. I think we'll, from the point of view of taking a first pass on what's going to affect the politics of this, I think it's better to think about perhaps what people who are less nuanced will do and think. And the less nuanced position is to, as we've discussed, take the attitude that actually you can't get this trade-off right. All right, so there's full steam ahead and there's basically stop, and everything in between maybe is unstable and relies on you trusting the scientists, but they can't be trusted, or trusting the tech entrepreneurs or CEOs, but they will prove 100 times they can't be trusted. So should you trust them again? No, you should shut the whole thing down. I think that is a very stable political orientation in a way that this kind of navigating between, what is it, Cilia and Charybdis? I don't know how to say it. Just seems like maybe it isn't. So let's take a more extreme position in the bottom left among the Kubernites, which is skeptical of capitalism in the first place, increasingly skeptical of big tech on the back of mass surveillance enabled by that technology, and now mass job displacement potentially. Of course, that's still a question mark. What do they think is a good outcome? Well, a good outcome would be a human-centered economy and political system where there's maybe not much more tech than what we have now, or the deployment of AI is very limited. So I don't know where the line... what do they think is... What does somebody who's anti-capitalism actually want? I mean, they want less development. They want less heavy industry. I don't think all of them want an alternative political system like capitalism. I mean, like communism necessarily, but a more participatory political system. But what does that look like? What is the good outcome for this camp? I mean, is AI just outlawed, or is it heavily regulated like internet? I mean, big tech is much more regulated in Europe than it is in the US, right? So maybe just an extremely tightly regulated set of AI tools, very limited integration between them, very few AIs that pretend to be interacting like humans, much more tool-oriented. You have an AI sitting in your Slack channel that might summarize things or do menial tasks, but maybe you're not allowed to have systems that are, I don't know, much more advanced than that. But even that already seems like it'd automate many jobs and create plenty of unhappy humans. So I don't know where the stable... Like, what is the stable goal for the bottom left?
Yeah, I think I would in broad terms say the goal is stringent regulation on this and other new technologies, very, very stringent, very strict, in order to preserve, as you said, a human-centered economy, which is really a either a status quo as it is now, or in some ways a regression to a smaller scale economy. So regression towards an idealized and often, or mostly, honestly, fictional past of more localized production and consumption, less globalization of the economy built around large capitalist, large institutions and organizations of capital, so large governments and large corporations. And to go one level sort of a little bit meta on this, I can imagine that a good outcome would be for these new AI tools to be put to use in effective service of more stringent regulation in general, across all industries and across the entire economy. In other words, if these tools could be used to rein in the inefficiencies and corruption and excesses of capitalism itself, that would be probably an additional win. And maybe there are some folks who are seeing some potential for these new tools to increase transparency, increase accountability, and make cheating and corruption and the avoidance of existing regulation and any new regulation we manage to put in place to rein things in. I can see that as again, playing sort of devil's advocate here, or putting on the hat of the Kubernites. I can see that as a desirable outcome. Now, whether or not that's stable, I mean, maybe in the minds of the Kubernites, there's some sort of stable condition there that persists for a while, but I don't know what then the thinking there is for a GI. It's harder for me to put myself in the position. Like I don't know what these. I mean, almost like these, almost like the folks in this quadrant can't conceive of the singularity, of a singularity. Is that seems like it's unimaginable to this interest group, and so it's hard for me to therefore imagine what they would consider a good outcome to be from a massively changed world that has super intelligence in it or something like that. That's more difficult. But in the nearer term, as just an extension of the status quo and the existing, broad brush painting of left liberal progressive ideology, better regulation that does a more reliable job of reining in the excesses of capitalism. That seems like it as a very large and general goal. That seems like it would be a good outcome. So that would mean, yes, regulating the AI tech itself, preventing it from making the worst excesses of capitalism even worse than they already are, and in the best case scenario, using AI itself to do that job of getting using the AI itself to do the job of reining in those excesses. That would be probably the very best outcome. But again, I think this is all quite short term. I don't know how this group sees out to a more distant technological horizon at all.
Well, yeah, I mean, Matt's comment that this crowd are already anti some of the most powerful forces in our society, and maybe that's a bad sign for the present and a bad sign for the future. But we can cast our minds back to the early 20th century, where you could have said the same in the 19th century, late 19th century, about communism. In the early 20th century, against all expectations, the situation started to change, and what seemed like it was a movement that was anti all the power, the imperialists, the monarchy, the capitalists, nonetheless had many victories and captured a large percentage of the world's population in terms of its ideology. So it's not like these things are foretold. However, the narrative of communism was not like only these things are bad. It had a utopian vision. But it's hard to imagine now having a similar ideology, because even communism itself seems like, how could it possibly resist the siren song of magic technology that will realize all the visions of the ideology? Right? It's just, I mean, capitalism itself was part of the plan for a communist utopia. There was always supposed to be a kind of heavily industrialized phase that would lead to a different arrangement. AI fits into that very well. So I do feel like it's quite difficult to come up with a positive, optimistic vision which doesn't just seem like the accelerationists plus a bit more curmudgeon-like behavior where you're carefully sidestepping the landmines. So yeah, I tend to agree that, hence why I'm a bit pessimistic about there being some stable alternative in the bottom left, which isn't just really quite anti. But maybe we can, I mean, look at social movements in the world today, like Trumpism, which are quite anti today's intellectual elites, the successors of which might be AIs or not. That's also not really positively oriented, but nonetheless very powerful. Fascism was not a positively oriented ideology, but succeeded to a large degree. So just because there isn't a positive vision for the future necessarily doesn't mean things can't work. Although maybe that's being unfair to fascism. Maybe fascism did have, at least for some people, a fairly convincing story about a return to a better arrangement. So maybe the actual stable ideology in the bottom left is something more like fascism, unfortunately. Maybe that's being too harsh. I'm not sure. I mean, I would put myself perhaps in the bottom left if I had to choose. So I don't like that conclusion. But
Well, one thing that I'm curious about, in the bottom left, so the thing that distinguishes the Kubernetes from the accelerationists is sort of their support of the rapidity of the adoption of technology. So we have two sort of things that can happen in that bottom left quadrant, I think. On the one hand, you could have sort of technology stays static, its progress is halted or slowed, to an imperceptibly, an imperceptible rate of progress, a rate of improvement. I don't think regress is really plausible. I'm not sure. I think there are some in the environmental sphere that might genuinely want that, but probably the quadrant as a whole wouldn't want full-on proper regression technologically. But we could also have in that bottom left quadrant folks who just want quite a slow progression, and it may be that is something like, let's indulge more authoritarian, top-down control from governments, ideally democratic governments, but nevertheless control in the left authoritarian sense, in the name of ensuring, for example, that society has time to adapt, even if those adaptations are quite extreme. For example, let's do the whole thing slowly enough that we can bring on quite radical government programs like a universal basic income, for example. Maybe that's not incompatible with the Kubernetes stance. It's just a matter of doing it slowly enough. I mean, maybe that's one interpretation of how the interest groups that might identify in that camp, how they might stand in respect to AI. Whereas the risk of the accelerationist camp up above is that we don't have a chance to get the social and policy and other elements in order. We don't have a chance to get all those ducks in a row before the change is just too radical, too transformative to manage.
Yeah, I guess I'm making a mistake by talking about fascism in the bottom left. Of course, Kubernetes has left and right, so fascism obviously belongs more in the bottom right. I guess that feeds into... Jeff was posting in the Discord after our conversation last week some links to statements from the Pope about AI and how developments should keep humans in the center and other sensible sounding things. Maybe it seems like a bit unfair to use terms like fascism to describe what are right now extremely peaceful groups of people who don't seem to have agendas that involve any violence. And I don't mean to paint them with a negative brush at all, but this could all go very smoothly and peacefully. On the other hand, the early 20th century also looked like it might go quite smoothly, but did not. It's not ridiculous when there are transitions of this scale that things do not go peacefully at all. And so it's, I think, not incorrect to entertain the possibility that various of these groups trend towards violence or more oppressive behavior, at least some extreme parts of them. So I hope that doesn't seem unfair. Maybe I'll make a point here that it's quite interesting to see the AI safety community, on the one hand, freaking out and talking about how, maybe it's all over and it's too late and there's nothing we can do. And these are very peaceful nerd types in general, but they're sitting there thinking, there's nothing we can do. But a large percentage of the population hearing these arguments, if they were convinced, would see some obvious things to do, which involve various forms of violence. That's kind of not an option that seems, ready to hand for the nerd types. But as things progress, it's not hard to see. I mean, there are violent acts by some of these groups in the bottom left already, right? And if the stakes seem much higher, it seems unlikely to me that we don't have some forms of violence. So, yeah, it's right now things seem quite quiet, relatively speaking, but we have to expect, if we're right about these kinds of timelines, that things are going to get much more unsettled over the next decade. Yeah, right, Matt. I I have friends who are in those kinds of hacking circles, so at least against surveillance. I don't know what they're up to these days, but I could easily imagine that you know having various disruptive plans in place might not be outside the realm of their imagination. Which quadrants agree with this? What is capitalism for? Again, let's use AI for that instead. Yeah, do we accelerate or steer? That seems like a bit of a false choice in a way, the way you present it, right? Like, obviously we should steer, but it seems to me that to come back to Peter Thiel's comment, if you don't think there is, like, humans are just not very good at coordinating, right? So if you think that, look at regulation, for example, we either don't regulate or we over-regulate. This seems to be kind of how we manage things. So you see quite sensible people in the US saying things like, let's take Mark Andreessen. I'll come back to Peter Thiel in a moment. Mark Andreessen and many others in Silicon Valley would point out that you see rapid rises in costs in sectors that are regulated by the government or subsidized by the government, things like healthcare, education, housing. Those costs just go up as you go to the right. And the sectors where the government is not pharmaceuticals is another one. The other sectors which are less regulated, the costs are following, so they would say, the law of the market, there's competition, and the prices just decrease exponentially over time, things like semiconductors or just IT. Now, I'm not sure I completely sign up to that argument, but I think there's a lot of truth in it as well. And so once you introduce the possibility for regulation, well, of course, there's a lot of power seeking and rent seeking by the regulators themselves and the entrenched companies. We don't have reliable long-term methods of really controlling that process. So if you want reliable long-term growth, someone like Mark Andreessen would say, even if you know there are going to be downsides from regulation, you should keep your foot off that pedal. Another example would be the FDA failing to approve many drugs, and there's sort of like an invisible graveyard, I forget whose term that is, of people who have died from not being able to access treatments because they were overregulated. So the same people are making the argument right now, as Mark Andreessen is, that the people talking about regulating AI are the same people who have killed thousands from over-regulating the production of drugs, have prevented cities from having affordable housing by over-regulating the production of housing, etc., etc. So that's actually a pretty strong argument, I think. Over-regulations on treatment by the FDA. Yeah, that's just the point, that the process of getting a drug approved is extremely laborious and risky, so that you could have a lighter touch on regulation and leave more to the market. Now that has downsides in that people would sometimes, given the profit motive, companies would put out drugs that were unsafe. They already still do that, right? Even with the current extreme regulatory system. But the argument is that you have to think about this on balance, right? It's not that there are no costs if you fail to approve many drugs. The cost is just invisible, and therefore you tend to be willing to pay it. But anyway, that's kind of a whole nother can of worms.
Yeah, I think there are just too many ways in which the the Andreessen's analysis and the examples that are there, they don't. I don't mean to just sort of come out swinging with a cudgel, but none of it holds up to scrutiny. The examples don't hold up. The categories don't hold up. There's something, I think, sort of superficially appealing to the logic of the simple narrative that, if you regulate something, then you choke out the competition and you make room for bloat and inefficiency, and that translates into higher costs and yada yada. But that's sort of a very sophomoric right libertarian take that's pretty popular in certain circles and certainly in the United States. But like, if you look at these little specific examples, okay, healthcare system bloated with cost, inefficient, but in the United States, that's mostly in the United States that's the case. And in the United States, we have a very toxic combination of ineffectual government regulation, not over-regulation, combined with a massively inefficient market. There isn't competition. That's why the healthcare system is so abysmal. The market there's catastrophic market failure in the healthcare sector for a variety of reasons, for monopolization and cronyism, and a little bit of captive agency going on. There's also perverse incentives. Insurance companies maximize their and hospitals maximize their profit when they don't serve the customer as opposed to when they do. So incentives are upside down compared to most industries, and on and on and on. And then you go to the extreme. What does an even more regulated health industry look like? Well, it looks like national health care, which is what other civilized countries have got, and it's much cheaper and it works much better. So, and that's just one. You could make a very similar argument for education versus nationalized higher education and so forth. So I think it's superficially appealing, but when you dig into it, it's really pretty dumb. And I that's my general experience with right libertarianism across the board. It doesn't hold up to scrutiny when you start thinking through the specifics. It sounds great in simple black and white idealistic terms, and then when it encounters the muddiness and the gray of the real world, it collapses. So I just didn't find that very persuasive. I'm willing to grant that under some circumstances, and I don't think it's the majority of circumstances, regulation could definitely get in the way. And so the example of pharmaceuticals is certainly one, and the invisible graveyard is a compelling picture. But there's also an awful big invisible graveyard, certainly a potential one, for drugs that have been approved that have turned out to be very dangerous, and people have died injured or died as a result of them. And so you could make the argument the other way around quite well, I think, that failure to regulate results in rash recklessness by industry, and you get a lot of negative externalities as a result of that. And so that would be familiar to any environmentalist. I think I'm broadly speaking, I come down pretty hard against what Anderson is putting forth there.
Yeah, let me steelman maybe the objection to the reasonable Kubernetes position that I think Matt holds. So, okay, we're sitting here in 2023. Seems like there's rapid progress. We don't know what the timelines are. Governments wake up. They start listening to Matt. They put in place regulations that mean that companies need to invest more in safety. They need to report a lot more about the capabilities of their systems. There's coordination, and there's limits on things like Bing or Sydney being deployed publicly until we understand their effects. Yes. Okay, so that seems all good to me. I presume that sounds all right to you, Matt. So that buys us some time, perhaps, to understand these systems and how to move ahead in a way that preserves human agency and also human life. But once that system is in place in the government, it becomes clear that actually you need to collect a lot of information about what the companies are doing, and they start shifting activities to countries that are not cooperating with those regulations. So there are data centers popping up in the Caribbean. the Chinese are sort of maybe resisting some of the international coordination, and they start to move ahead more quickly. There's a lot of pressure to either drop the regulations or to make them much more strict. The reaction of governments when people break regulations is not to question, should we get this more right? It's to crack down, right? Because it's a challenge to their legitimacy. And in a situation where the big tech companies seem to be holding the golden goose that is the source of all power in the future, I don't think national governments are going to look kindly on those companies skirting around or reinterpreting the regulations. They will make the regulations more strict. And there's a kind of slippery slope down there towards very tight international coordination and the kind of totalitarian world government that Peter Thiel is worried about. That's the argument, I think, that to steelman the position of someone who's against today's baby steps towards regulation. Now, I think that's kind of like suicidal, but yeah, that's just how I think they would make the argument for it.
Yeah, I think that's a very good steel man. I think that's you've definitely put the strongest case forward for that general line of thinking. And as as you said, there is some element of that is sensible and that is compelling. Yeah. But of course, I agree with you that I think it would be it's potentially quite suicidal to pursue that. But the way that you present it, I think is strong.
And I think that if I was to put myself in the shoes of Demis Hassabis or Sam Altman or any of these figures who are sort of behind the progress, I might feel that in the face of that situation evolving, right, I can see that political train getting rolling. And I think that actually this might be our one chance to crack through to the next phase of human existence, right? So you can see this attitude pretty clearly in Elon Musk, for example, with Mars, right? So he said very clearly that he thinks that maybe there's a very short window in which we have both the technology and the civilizational stability to actually achieve this, and now's the time. Now, if Musk sees the window closing because there's degeneration politically and over-regulation of space travel, and it seems like actually we have not much time to get this done, he's not going to slow down, right? He's going to speed up and pull all his capital into this short window where it seems like it might be possible. So the other risk of reasonable regulation development, as I would see it, is that once it gets into the hands of the political system with all its vested interests, many of which are not tech-oriented and will see closing this window as the only means to survive, right, given the disruptions, that once it seems like the game's going against the tech companies or whoever's behind the AI progress, it will motivate drawing forward all the investments in order to try and crack through while there's time. So I think, yeah, that's right. So I think that what we should expect, I think that's what's going to happen, frankly. So I think there will be good faith attempts at regulation. They will kind of go too far, and this will sort of accelerate both sides, and so that things will play out very rapidly. That's kind of how things seem to go. And it's not like I can see both sides as being quite reasonable by their own lights, because the regulatory side, it starts with people like Matt, but then as the tech companies are trying to escape the regulations and are clearly defying the spirit of the let's save humanity regulators, they will crack down more and become less nuanced about their positions, and the tech companies will in kind respond by going full steam ahead. Um, so I'm not saying either side is wrong there, but that's my default expectation for how this plays out. I'm interested in if you see any flaws with that.
Well, the one thing I would add, not so much a flaw, but I would add a nuance there. I think it makes sense. Anyway, the thing I would add is that the regulators, I don't have confidence that the regulators will be able to keep up with the not so much keep up with the progress, but rather, I guess, what am I trying to say? I think.
I'm sorry,
okay, well,
I'm just going to have to step out for 1 minute. Sorry, I'll be back.
Sure. Yeah, what is it? Well, maybe a good way to say it, rather than state it in the abstract, let me give you the specific example I'm thinking of, and then we can use that to back into the abstract if that makes sense. So what I'm thinking of, for example, I can imagine regulation emerging fairly quickly to limit how and where and when chatbots like ChatGPT or Bing's chat services with Sydney and so forth, those are rolled out, made available, under what circumstances, and so forth. So that's a specific application of AI technology. I can think. So here's another example. I can imagine that governments will very carefully regulate autonomous driving technology. So there's sort of the AI in cars. And I can imagine that being regulated quite aggressively. And there may even be some companies that are working on both of those things. Google, for example, or Tesla, maybe potentially, if they, move further into the AI space. Another example might be with sort of humanoid robotics. Tesla is talking about making a humanoid robot. There are other companies that are talking about that as well. And as exciting as it might be from a technological perspective to see humanoid robots doing the terribly dangerous toil and drudgery in various occupations that humans are in right now, that can also be a big target for regulation. But I can see all of that regulation happening while none of the AGI risk is mitigated through regulation at all. And the AI alignment community, to my understanding, is overwhelmingly concerned and talking about doomsday scenarios in the context of AGI and not the regulation of narrow AI in these specific applications like ChatGPT and self-driving cars and humanoid robotics and so on. And so I think we need to be perhaps a little, I think that's my generalization from those specific examples, is that we probably need to be a little more nuanced in what we mean by regulation and what gets regulated specifically and where the real risks are. I mean, certainly there are some risks to society of various kinds, literally risk to life and limb through self-driving cars that aren't ready, to risk socially. I mean, there was a lot of risk with social media, it turned out, and does, and will continue to do massive amounts of psychological and sociological damage to especially to young people, which we didn't anticipate, and we aren't regulating enough even still. So I can imagine a scenario where regulation definitely occurs and goes awry, but yet completely fails to miss the mark by not having its eye on the real prize, the real target, which in my mind, the existential risk is not from chatbots or from humanoid robots taking people's jobs in factories. The existential risk is, the Skynet scenario where you have an AGI, agentic or sapient, or in particular, that then becomes very difficult to, or impossible really, to have any influence over. And if it's not aligned out of the gate, we're in real trouble. So yeah, I think we're talking about multiple lines of regulation here. And I can see those becoming muddied and confused and deliberately conflated by the industry to serve their interests, and all the rest of that sort of stuff. It's not monolithic, I guess, is my main point.
Yeah, I think partly the reason I'm bringing up that scenario is I can see a short-term future in which young people have to kind of choose to either go and work on safety inside DeepMind, so they're sort of a safety-oriented voice inside an accelerationist institution, if that's fair, or they have to go and work inside some government body which is attempting to slow down AI progress, so the regulators. And there they might be, relatively speaking, like a progressive / accelerationist voice, right? They don't want AI to stop. They want the fruits of the technology, but they see the progress as being too careless and want to make sure it is done properly. But the broader institution, I think, just by the nature of the players involved, will tend over time to be fairly, perhaps from their point of view, over-regulatory, or running the risk of just stopping things completely. So I guess those are the two choices, perhaps. Maybe it's more complex than that. But yeah, maybe we should spend the remaining time. Let's get to the topic of the Manhattan Project, shall we? Unless there's other things on this board that you want to comment on.
Just one more quick thing to comment on, and I'm just seeing Peter Thiel and the military-industrial complex there, and that is, I haven't spent too much time looking at Thiel's work and so forth, but I did watch a talk a while back, maybe several years ago now, and one thing that struck me and really stuck with me was how he seems to be genuinely concerned, or his thinking is organized around a genuine concern, I believe, about violence. So he seems to be very concerned and very committed to avoiding violence between nation states. That seems to me, and perhaps social unrest with it, and civil violence as well. But that seemed to be very, very much an organizing principle behind his thinking. That above all else, we need to find a way to avoid violence, and that a lot of his other thinking, some of which is quite extreme, perhaps, it makes a bit of sense organized through that lens. And my interpretation, I could be wrong. I don't know his work or his thinking well enough. But my interpretation is that general line of thinking is in accordance with certain interpretations of the military-industrial complex and the political right, which is that the way to preserve peace and to avoid violence is by having overwhelming power and overwhelming command of force, such that violence is unthinkable. So you have mutually assured destruction with nuclear technology. That'll loop us back into the Manhattan Project. But in general, that this is sort of part of the American ultranationalism that I sort of get a vibe from folks like Peter Thiel.
Oh, but Adam, isn't that what
I could be wrong, but sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, isn't that what you said at the beginning of this conversation? You didn't. You said it in a much friendlier way, but you said that you're in favor of acceleration because you think there are good parties and bad parties, and that the good parties should get there first.
Yes, you're right. Guilty. So this is this. You're right. This type of thinking is there is. Oh, I mean, it's frustratingly compelling. This argument it's such a coincidence
that the good parties happen to be American.
Yes, exactly right. And it's funny. I mean, I don't tend to think of this through necessarily the lens of the nation state all that much. I think I'm more naturally inclined to think of this through the lens of corporate institutions and power more so. But I don't know. I mean, there may be a role for both. Certainly, there's a role for both. But there's just this core logic that if you want to avoid violent conflict, it helps to have just one, to have a very polarized situation. If you have a unipolar world where one entity has vastly more power than anything else, then that seems to be a stable condition for avoiding violence, because it just there isn't enough room for competition in any meaningful sense that could lead to conflict and violence. You just can't win against an overwhelmingly powerful adversary, and so peace prevails, as it were. And I you know that there's
Peace
that
prevails
line
after
of think that
after the
that line of thinking
war of
for certain.
unification.
Yeah. Well, it holds some water, right? I mean, that's
Yes.
the you know you this is kind of like, if it was, what's the analogy? I forget. There's a famous quote, but it's about fathers and brothers and stuff. Anyway, this is like dad's job in the household. Like, you know, if it obviously ends up at a certain age, and the boys in the household will eventually grow up and mature into powerful enough individuals that they can challenge their father. But at a certain point, you can have like 4 or 5 brothers and siblings, and they're all kind of competitive with one another. But we avoid violence because the threat of dad is there, and
Yes.
dad's the authority, and dad just keeps the peace, and that's it. But if there was no dad there, then there would be blood. And and again, this isn't ancient. This is not a new line of thinking at all. This goes back a long, long way. But there's this, there's Roman writings and philosophy and in ancient Greek and stuff that touches on all of this, thinking about power and so forth. So anyway, that upper right quadrant, I think, is definitely very much in that of that sort of thinking, but perhaps through the lens of nationalism, in a way that the left column isn't, so much through the lens of nationalism.
I think that's a very astute insight.
So.
Yeah. All right, Manhattan Project. Are you joining? If they ask.
Who's the question for?
Everybody. Let's see. Why would they ask you, Adam? Well, you write a report this year or next year which accurately forecasts the development of various inputs into the AGI race, and just like they needed to coordinate a network of factories across the US to refine uranium, and they need coordinators for that, they see your expertise as essential to coordinating the private-public partnership around data centers, GPU production, securing the supply routes from Taiwan, etc. And they ask you to play a leadership role in that new organization. What do you say?
Hell. That's a question. Oh, shit. I mean, it's really difficult.
Okay, let me up the stakes a bit. So they reveal to you information that seems credible coming through the NSA about China's version of the Manhattan Project, where somewhere in the districts of Shanghai they're building an underground network of data centers, and they have secured supplies of the latest NVIDIA chips through some black market, or they've somehow managed to crack making them themselves. And best estimates put the timelines for them. I mean, there's some scaling law-based calculation that makes it look plausible that there'll be human-level AI produced, given their current plans, within 5 years.
Oh yeah. What are the consequences of saying no? This is another question. I mean,
Are they going to incarcerate you or something?
well, I mean, not so much me. I mean, I think I would be willing to take a stand if it were only myself at stake. But I've got family and I've got children, and I would have to, I mean, you would imagine if this is the Manhattan Project, maybe saying no isn't really an option.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I don't know the history there well enough, but I presume that when they invited people to participate, there was like a vague invitation at the beginning that didn't reveal anything, and you could say no to it. I'm pretty sure that people did say no.
Oh, that's a good, that's a specific detail about the Manhattan Project that would be very, very useful to know. Like, could you realistically say no without having your life ruined or or otherwise. But on pure principle, um, it isn't a slam dunk to me. I think I'm tenuously leaning towards saying yes, given the scenario you've presented, which is that there's a very plausible possibility that without a U.S. Manhattan project, China wins the race and develops AGI first. Um, but I guess my main problem here is that I don't have a huge amount of confidence that uh, that either a U.S. government victory or a Chinese government victory would be in the best interest of humanity. And I'm not really even sure that those two things are all that distinguishable from each other. Um, so uh, uh, I don't have a huge amount of faith, and I can see some very specific risks there, perhaps as well. Um, uh, for example, an AGI, if AGI were to be developed by government, then that AGI would more readily potentially have access to government systems, as opposed to, for example, if OpenAI developed AGI. I mean, if we're taking all of the sci-fi
Yeah,
ASI super
I think
intelligent
I think you're
scenarios, you know, I
dodging
mean,
dodging the
it can hack
question a
its way
bit.
into whatever. But yeah, I know I'm dodging the question a little bit. I mean, I think I would probably reluctantly say yes and join the project because um, if nothing else, if it turned out that it was all terrible, I could work to sabotage it from within. Um,
So many
and
people say very unlikely.
yeah, that's and if it's
No,
not me,
no
it's
offense,
somebody
Adam.
else. But yeah, I know. It's tough. It's like, I mean, it is. It's a no-win scenario. It's very difficult to see a positive outcome there. I think I would prefer to work, if I were called up, I would prefer to work on a project that were, um, uh, that were had some. Well, I don't know.
It's all right. You said
No, I
yes.
mean, I'll just stop hemming and hawing, and I'll just say, yeah, I would probably answer the call. I mean, again, because I don't see how not answering it leads to a better outcome. I don't see how that. I mean, okay, so I say no. What's the better outcome as a result of saying that? I don't see it. I don't see it. Doesn't create a better outcome for me to say no than to say yes and join the project and try to at least steer, as we were saying before. I mean, if you could do anything to steer things in a better direction, you probably should. Um, so
Okay, what about you, Matt?
My joking answer is that Seneca, Cicero, I think Machiavelli, just off the top of my head, people who wrote famous books in political exile, rather than when they were working for the government. So I don't know if you get remembered for that part of the work. That's my joking answer. I don't know. What's the you gave a plausible scenario for Adam about why they would ask him. Why have they asked me?
Okay, because
Am I actually going to be?
OpenAI is nationalized. Jan Leica is in charge of alignment there, and he's recruited into the Manhattan Project as they're in alignment contingent. And he says he reaches out to graduate students in the area and says, well, we have a lot of resources and not a lot of time, and I don't really trust these military types. They're going to go too fast, and the only chance we have of avoiding the catastrophic outcomes we all expect is for you and everybody like you to come and join the project and hopefully shape it from the inside.
Um, yeah, I think I'd ask what kind of tasks I'm going to be doing day to day. Because if I'm going to be straight up like running capabilities experiments, then, well, I mean, I don't know if I really ask for that, but that's one thing. Whereas if there's a contingent within this group that is doing kind of conceptual work, and I don't know, maybe I could be a good red teamer. This is the kind of people who try to point out, who try to critique these models. You know, they're given special access to them, and try to come up with ways to show them having problematic behaviors or functionalities or whatever that weren't intended, as a way to kind of nip those in the bud or something like that before they cause bigger problems later. And they have like an adversarial relationship with the developers, right? Because the developers have an incentive to make it a success, whereas the red team have an incentive to kind of point out the ways in which the project has failed. And I think maybe I could feel all right about doing that kind of work.
All right, so you both join the Manhattan Project. It succeeds after 4 years of hard work, and then a wave of...
No, wait, Dan, before we get there, you have to tell us your... No, you're worming your way out of this. No way, buddy. Let's hear it.
Yeah, I have thought quite a bit about it. I still don't have an answer. I think I would join.
Okay, so I have a fun scenario just real quickly, and this is just to dig into this question about, is it better to be in a project at all as opposed to being on the sidelines? So here's the scenario. It's a little silly, but here's the scenario, and this is for all of us. What if you get 2 calls back to back? Make it on the same afternoon if you want it to really, juxtapose them. But say you get so that you guys are Australian, I believe both of you. And I don't know who else is here with us, but I believe I'm the only American, so maybe that's a little weird. But let's say, because I'm in perhaps in the more difficult position as a patriot. But you guys, say you get a call from both the U.S. Manhattan Project and the China Manhattan Project. Which one do you join, or do you say no to both of them, and why?
I think there's no circumstance under which I would join a Chinese Manhattan Project. I think the political system is too dangerous, too unhinged. The American political system and leadership is also dangerous and unhinged, and even more likely to cause nuclear annihilation, I think, than the Chinese. So I have very little trust of both, and sympathy for China as well as for America. But as an Australian, our geopolitical position is what it is, and it doesn't change just because I wish it is otherwise. And America is our ally, and China is not. So I think it's very clear which one I would join. Having said that, I think that the Chinese government probably ends up with a much more sane policy towards AGI than the US. That's my impression, based on what they've said so far. They're not... they're less likely to barrel sort of madly ahead. I think the spectre of Chinese AGI development that's raised in the West is largely self-serving and just a kind of a convenient fiction for the accelerationists to go faster. I'm not sure it corresponds to actually what China wants to do. I think China will feel drawn into this race because the Americans are in the race. I don't think it's what they want. I think it's America is ahead, has the capabilities, has the companies, and could, if it wanted to, slow down the race, but I don't think that they will choose to. So, yeah, I would go with the Americans.
Well, so I guess part of it depends on what we're envisioning the outcome is here. So Dan, you were starting to talk about the outcome. So let's hear that, and then there are some things to think about. Like whether it really matters and what things might matter if AGI does indeed emerge, and then under various assumptions, what its capabilities are and when, like how quickly its capabilities evolve or something like that. I mean, we're talking if you. There's a wide range of perspectives on this. Some quite extreme ones, the Eliezer Yudkowskis of the world are imagining, extreme capability very quickly and so forth. But so we'd have to decide on the scenarios whether we think the outcome is materially different, where of where it's developed, like where this technology is developed.
Okay, so here's the story. So Adam Dorr, from within his perch in the second Manhattan Project, gives this blurb about how the only way to peace is Leviathan, and so the millions of drones fly across the Pacific and destroy the installations in Shanghai where the AGI was being developed, and set up a kind of quisling government in China oriented around preventing any resurgence of their AI program. The UN convenes, and given the overwhelming power of the Americans with the robot factories and the AGI behind it, agree that there will be a kind of new nuclear accords where there will be a unipolar world. Only Americans will be allowed to have AGIs, and that is enforced by a worldwide system of digital surveillance, AGI-based incursions into all computer systems to monitor them for AI progress, and also physical versions of that, particularly in China, given the sort of remnants of the engineering capability there. And that is maybe a golden age in some sense afterwards, but it may be extremely violent in the aftermath of our success in the Manhattan Project.
Shall we put forth a few these fun different scenarios? It might be fun to think
go
through
ahead.
some of the different ones. So how about a scenario in which so as the modeling and development and training progresses, it becomes increasingly clear that it doesn't that the nuances and the distinctions between the teams who are pursuing this make very little difference, and the only thing with substantial influence over the behavior and the potential outcomes resulting from the behavior of AGI, which is destined to immediately, extremely rapidly become ASI and become extraordinarily capable. The only difference, the only influence you can really have is on the core training data that many of the models are developed on. And so the big difference there is whether or not you train on the internet writ large, and it's predominantly Western languages, that sphere of that portion of the internet, and they're connected but not deeply, of course, or whether it's trained on China's internet and all of that data. And that the bulk of the difference that you get isn't whether Google develops it or the US government develops it or OpenAI develops it, but whether or not you train the AI on the Western internet or the Chinese internet. And that's the only thing that influences the outcome and the behavior at all of the system that emerges. And the system that emerges it proves very rapidly to be completely uncontrollable and uninfluenceable by human interests at all. There's simply no way for humanity to have any influence over this system whatsoever. And it simply does its own thing. And so we only really have one shot, which is to decide what to train these damn things on. And if we train it on whatever the hell Sydney was trained on, that leads to the extinction of humanity. And if we train it on a better corpus of material that isn't so deeply antisocial and psychopathic, than tech support calls, then the outcome is a much higher probability of being better. So that's the only thing that makes a damn bit of difference, and it doesn't matter because there's strong convergence as you race up the intelligence ladder towards similar set of priorities, goals, values, and behaviors.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So in other words, a rejection of the orthogonality thesis.
Yeah, we can argue about that some other time. But yeah, I tend to agree. I think people over focus on the current paradigm. So when AlphaGo was around, people were excited about how it learned from human games and how therefore it had a residue of like the humanness of the way we play Go, and like maybe it was us teaching our descendants and they would carry on our traditions. And then, 6 months later, AlphaZero kind of nuked that romantic vision because it didn't learn from any human games at all. I think we're in a similar kind of delusion about our influence over models like GPT-3. I mean, it's trained on all our books and so on, and so maybe it has some like core similarity with our culture because of that. I think this is a bit of a delusion. I think I'm not saying there will be a version of GPT that's like GPT-0 that doesn't need any human data. That doesn't make any sense given that it's oriented around our language. But I think you can overestimate how central the human worldview will be to descendants of the GPT series. I think it's a bit of a mistake, as you're saying. I mean, as they progress in power, they will leave that behind fairly quickly, or at least instantiate inner models that don't have much in common with our way of thinking. Yet, as both you and Matt observed earlier, in this scenario with the US versus China, I don't care who wins. If humans survive, we made it. That's what I care about, and that's at the end of the day why I would join the Manhattan Project. I think that's the stakes, and it's too hard to the other outcomes are so hard to influence. I think it's very, very difficult for individuals, like in any period of war, to have much of an influence over which way things go. You have an obligation to survive yourself and to protect your family, and in this case to maybe stop humanity from going extinct. But I feel no capability of influencing things beyond that. So that would be my focus and why I would join.
Well, in this case, Dan, I think what your reasoning points to a very profound difference between what's happening now and the Manhattan Project, the real Manhattan Project, and where the parallel really does break down. And that, in my mind, is the biggest difference. I think it's quite obvious, and that's that nuclear weapons don't have a actively productive upside. I mean, maybe you could talk about civilian nuclear power a little bit or something, but not really, right? They are overwhelmingly just weapons, just destructive, and maybe that overwhelming power in some, and you guys were, I think, very astute to invoke Leviathan, and in some Hobbesian sense, there's this power that they have to force a peace and a stability and an order upon the world because of their massive destructive potential. Okay, but nuclear weapons don't have this incredible potential upside that manifests at so many different levels, and and along the way, as we're progressing towards some future conditions as well. So it's not just we cross the finish line and suddenly the benefits arrive, and we're going to see these benefits roll out progressively as we race up the curve. That's a fundamental difference here. Is that the potential upside is just staggering. It's almost unimaginable how incredible the future could be as a result of artificial intelligence and artificial general intelligence and artificial superintelligence. The potential for prosperity, the potential for the realization of the very best of human aspirations, and the solution to many of our problems, and just the possibilities that open up are absolutely staggering and truly inspiring to think about. And depending on how you want to do the calculus, how you want to do the numbers, I mean, it could be worth the risks. The upside could be so large, it could be indistinguishable from infinite, that maybe a lot of risk is justified if you're thinking long-termism and so forth. So this complicates the comparison very profoundly, very deeply. It might maybe it sort of fundamentally breaks the comparison between the original Manhattan Project and one that might occur the AGI arms race today. And So yeah, I think that's the stakes are very high. They're existential, but in quite a different way because of this upside. So I wonder how are you thinking that the two events, the historical Manhattan Project and this one, compare to one another in that way?
Yeah, I think, of course, they're different, but once we enter the race dynamic, I think it's a weapon first, and then it's everything else second. Because the logic around Leviathan and getting there first, I mean, you can hear the leaders of the tech companies even talking about it, right? They think they should get there first because they're the good guys. And that kind of power, I mean, there's not much. You could say the same thing about trying to acquire resources, right, before the First World War, or the way that fed into both of the world wars. Resources aren't weapons, but the desire to control them and to protect yourself is it ends in the same place. I'm not sure there's so much of a distinction. I think it's much more like the Manhattan Project than not. But we're out of time, so let me just say that you both passed the first round of interviews, and an agent will be showing up at your door soon. So this might be the last episode of the Disruption Seminar, because we're just going to go dark now. And okay, thanks everyone. We'll leave it at that for today.
Very good. Thanks, guys. We'll talk to you next week.